What makes a human a human? It sounds simple, maybe obvious, but if you really stop and think, what is it?
It's such a fundamental question, isn't
Yeah.
it? And that's exactly what we're digging into today. What does being human actually mean?
Yeah.
And how do things like race fit into that picture? Or maybe how don't they fit?
Right.
We've pulled together quite a mix of stuff for this. YouTube talks, Wikipedia deep dives on culture, ethnicity, race, even hair and melanin.
Hair and melanin. Okay.
Yeah. And Reddit threads, plus an academic paper looking at identity today. So a real range.
Okay, so the mission then is to unpack human identity. We're looking at race, sure, but also this pretty bold idea: all humans are apes, and color is a distraction.
Exactly. It sounds provocative, maybe?
A little.
But the hope is by exploring it, we'll get a clearer, maybe even surprising sense of what these terms mean based on, current science and social thought.
Okay, so we've got different perspectives from the sources. Identity debates, social construction of race, but also the biology stuff like skin color, hair, and the history of how we've defined culture and ethnicity.
Precisely. It's a wide net.
All right, let's jump in. That big one. What is a human being? Where do we even start? Is it biology, culture, how you see yourself?
It's definitely complex. Maybe starting with the biological angle makes sense. Fundamentally, okay, we're mammals, and that comes with certain traits. Hair, for example.
Hair. Okay, I wasn't expecting hair to be a major clue. What's the story there?
Well, it's kind of interesting. Our sources mention these three stages of growth: anagen, catagen, telogen. Each hair's on its own cycle.
Right.
But the speed it grows varies. Age, genetics, sex, even ethnicity, they all play a role. And thinking way back, evolutionarily, the idea is that fur, dense hair, might have started out as sensory hairs.
Sensory, like whiskers.
Sort of.
Mm-hmm.
Like tiny feelers giving early mammals info about their surroundings. Protection maybe came later.
Huh. So hair as sensors first, that's different. And then melanin, that seems more direct, linking to color.
It is direct, yeah. Eumelanin, pheomelanin. Those are the pigments giving color to skin and hair. But, and this is important, melanin does more than just color us.
Oh, like what?
Its main job, biologically, is protecting us from UV radiation. That's huge. And in other animals, it's even involved in immune responses. It's a pretty versatile molecule.
Okay, so melanin's a key protector, not just pigment. Got it. So that's a slice of the biology. But what about culture, society? Those feel just as important, right?
Absolutely crucial. Let's take culture. The sources trace how that word has been used. Originally it was often set against this idea of a state of nature.
Right, like civilized versus uncivilized.
Exactly. And unfortunately, that often led to ranking societies, creating hierarchies, which historically had some really negative outcomes, obviously.
Yeah, I can see how that could be misused.
Definitely. But thankfully, how we understand culture has broadened a lot. Now it's more about a group's particular way of life, shared customs, beliefs, art, music, food, all that rich diversity you see across the globe.
It's the shared stuff that makes a community. Okay. And then ethnicity. How does that fit in? Is it the same as culture?
It's related but distinct. Ethnicity often has this sense of shared roots, shared ancestry, maybe language, customs, a kind of common heritage. Think about ancient groups.
Like Greeks or Persians.
Yeah, exactly. They identified through those shared things: lineage, language, sacred places, rituals. It was about their tribe, their specific group, not really about skin color or some broad race.
So identity was much more local, more specific back then.
Very much so. But there's also the constructivist view, which points out that ethnicity is also something society imposes. It's not just who you think you are, but how society labels you based on its rules.
Okay. So internal feeling and external labels.
Right. And this leads us to a really key point from the sources. The whole idea of classifying people primarily by skin color, by race, in that modern sense, is actually quite recent. It's tied up with European exploration, colonization, and unfortunately, with scientific racism.
So people trying to categorize humanity, but often with biases already baked in.
That's a huge part of the history, yes. The idea of race, as we commonly understand it today, isn't some timeless biological fact.
Okay, that's really important. So the science today, where does it stand on race?
Well, the overwhelming scientific consensus, like what the American Anthropological Association states, is that race is primarily a social construct.
A social construct, meaning?
Meaning it's an idea created by society, by culture, by history, not a reflection of distinct underlying biological categories. Yes, there's human genetic variation, absolutely. But that variation doesn't map neatly onto the racial boxes we've created.
So the lines are fuzzy, or maybe just wrong.
You could say that. The genetic variation within a group we might call a race can be as big or bigger than the average variation between different races. Some researchers point out that how you even find genetic clusters depends entirely on how you sample populations. It highlights how arbitrary those lines can be.
Okay, wow. So this leads us right back to that phrase. All humans are apes, and color is a distraction. Let's break it down. All humans are apes. Where does that sit scientifically?
It's basic biological classification. We're primates, and within primates, we belong to the Hominoidea superfamily of the apes.
Yeah.
Alongside chimps, gorillas, orangutans, we share a common ancestor deep in the past.
Right. So zoologically speaking, we are apes.
Yeah.
Okay, that part's clear. Then the second part, color is a distraction. How does that follow?
Well, it builds directly on what we were just saying about race being a social construct. If those racial categories aren't reflecting deep biological divisions, and if skin color is just one trait among many,
Then focusing on it is maybe missing the bigger picture.
that's the argument. Physical anthropology largely moved away from thinking in terms of biological races back in the 1970s. And it's interesting, biology textbooks often kind of skirt the issue of race, probably because it's so tangled up in social and political stuff.
So science moved on, but society maybe hasn't quite caught up. We still seem very focused on color. Why?
Adaptation is a big part of the answer there. Think about why humans have head hair. One strong theory is protecting the scalp from intense UV radiation, especially as our ancestors spent more time out in the open savanna.
Okay, makes sense. Like a built-in hat?
Kind of.
Right.
And there's even a hypothesis that afro-textured hair evolved in Homo erectus partly for better UV protection and heat regulation. And melanin, as we said, is the key photoprotectant.
So tanning is just our body responding to sun.
Exactly. It's your body ramping up melanin production for more protection when UV exposure increases. So differences in skin color around the world look very much like adaptations to different levels of sunlight over long periods.
So it's an environmental adaptation, not some kind of fundamental marker of different types of humans?
Precisely. That's the key biological understanding, which leads some commentators in our sources to say these racial lines, often drawn based on color, are merely cosmetic or superficial compared to our shared biology.
Right, and you add things like ancestry tests showing how mixed most people actually are.
Yeah, that definitely muddies those old rigid categories, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It reinforces that we're all interconnected.
It really does. This connects to some really complex modern discussions too, doesn't it? Like the idea of transracialism.
It does touch on that, yeah. The sources bring up examples like Rachel Dolezal or Martina Big,
Yeah.
big individuals who identify with a race different from the one they were assigned at birth. And it's obviously very controversial.
Extremely.
Some arguments, like one analysis we looked at, suggest that if society accepts the concept of transgender identity, identifying with a gender different from the one assigned at birth, then logical consistency might imply accepting transracial identity too.
That's a specific argument being made, okay.
Yes. And historically, you have the phenomenon of racial passing, where individuals, for various reasons, were able or chose to live as members of a racial group different from their origin.
So identity isn't always fixed, but there seems to be a difference in acceptance, right? Gender identity shifts seem more widely acknowledged now than racial ones.
That's definitely a point raised. The sources note that gender voluntarism, the idea that one can choose or affirm their gender, is more accepted, while racial voluntarism remains highly contested. Often, this difference is linked to the very specific and painful history of race and racism, especially in places like the U.S., and concerns that claiming a different race might trivialize or appropriate the experiences tied to that race, particularly for marginalized groups.
Right, the historical weight is different.
Exactly. And the motivations people express for identifying as transracial can vary, feeling a deep, innate connection to another culture, like one Reddit user describing feeling Japanese despite their birth background, or seeking acceptance.
But the criticisms are strong too.
Oh yes, concerns about cultural appropriation, about potentially exercising white privilege in a new way, about ignoring the systemic nature of racism that people can't just opt out of. Some sources also emphasize that even within a group, say Black individuals, the experience isn't monolithic. Experiences of racism vary hugely.
It's incredibly layered.
Yeah.
And it brings up questions about social perception, doesn't it? Part of identifying as transgender often involves wanting to live and be treated as the gender you identify with. Could the same logic apply to race?
That's a question posed in the material. Could someone feel their identity aligns better with another race and wish to experience life and be perceived as part of that group? Legally, in many places, there's no law against being transracial or transgender, but societal validation is, well, very different.
Yeah.
And it touches on how social categories work. You see how racial categories are sometimes used politically to create division, like the Great Replacement Theory, which uses race to stoke fear and xenophobia. It's a stark example of the negative power these categories can hold.
Which comes back to color is a distraction. Focusing on these categories can pull attention away from shared problems or shared humanity.
That's the core of the argument. By fixating on these surface variations, these socially constructed boxes, we might be distracted from the fundamental biological unity of our species and inadvertently prop up systems of inequality.
Okay, so wrapping this up, the main takeaway seems to be, yes, we have physical differences, like skin color, but science increasingly sees these as adaptations to environment, not signs of fundamental separate biological races.
Exactly. The concept of race, as those rigid categories, is largely a social and historical invention. Our genetics show vast similarity and continuous variation, not distinct boxes.
And the distraction part is that focusing heavily on color, on these constructed racial categories, can obscure that shared humanity. It can divide us and maybe even be used to justify inequality.
Precisely. It distracts from the fact that, biologically speaking, we're one species that has adapted incredibly diversely to different corners of the planet.
So the final thought for you, our listener, is this. If race is mostly a social construct and our biological variations are adaptations, how should that change how we see ourselves and each other? Should we maybe shift focus away from these labels and more towards our common ground, our shared human experience?
It's definitely something worth thinking deeply about. What does it really mean for how we structure society, how we interact, if these categories aren't as real as we often treat them?
A lot to chew on there. Thanks for walking us through all that complexity.
Absolutely. It's fascinating stuff.
And to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive gave you some new perspectives. Maybe check out some of the science on human genetic variation yourself. It really challenges some common assumptions.